When I was in my 20s and 30s, I worked for the local cemetery in my town. All these years later, the things I saw in that hellscape will lurk in my dreams. I will wake with a start in the middle of the night, terrified of the memories of the dark echoes that walk those grounds. When the nightmares become frequent and sleep evades me, I pack up my belongings and move to the next city. For 20 years, I have never set roots in any of the places I have visited. A strange concept for me as I lived the first 37 years of my life in a small town. I have gotten to see the world. Isaac would be proud. But that adventurous excitement has been shallow and empty. The silence that accompanies me at night and when traveling through small towns petrifies me. I always chose the busiest cities that never seemed to sleep. Knowing that there are living people moving around me eases me into a deep, dreamless slumber. When I wake up from my drunken stupor inside of a bar, more often outside of a bar, I find myself questioning my life choices. As I nurse my hangover, the same thought echoes in my throbbing mind. Time to go home. The cemetery awaits you. The impossibility of that is more sobering than anything else. My hometown no longer exists. No trace, no whisper, no echo of a town that contained hell itself within its gates. A place that I was certain I would live and die in. Now no more than a bad memory that resurfaced only in my nightmares. A memory that I would pray to empty sky would permanently be forgotten at the end of this next bottle of bourbon. We had laid out our plans and knew that the time was tonight. The cemetery would be sealed permanently, and no one would enter ever again. Are you certain that this will work? Jacob asked, nervously picking at his nails. Of course not, but we have to do something. There is no way that Victor will allow us to just chain the gates and be done with that place, I said, grabbing at my hands to keep them from shaking. If Victor wants to stop us, he's going to have to overpower all 5 of us, Kyle said, a devious grin on his face at the thought of getting to punch Victor.
5? I don't know how much of a fight an old man like me could put up,
Eli said, pointing at his white hair with a wrinkly hand. Don't kid yourself, Eli. We have seen how spry you are, I said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Are you certain about destroying the fountain? Thomas asked. He had been the most quiet as we had discussed our plans. Kyle gave Thomas a light punch. We are barely sure about any of this. The key is that we do something. Hell, if we fail, it means we get to hang out with Michael for the rest of eternity. Victor is going to struggle to get in new people, so we might get to fuck around with him for the foreseeable future in our worst case scenario. We all agreed on moving forward, all of us nervous for the nights that lay ahead. That night, it was just to be Victor and Thomas working. The firmness of Thomas was a hitch to our plan. He simply had to keep Victor distracted long enough after the gates were locked at 9, while the rest of us went to work. As we packed Kyle's truck with chains and his welding machine, a holdover from his career path he had abandoned for easy money of the cemetery, when a rumble beneath our feet startled all of us. What was that? I blurted as Eli grabbed my shirt and the truck for balance. Who knows? This place has been going crazy since that tree was cut down, Jacob said, staring at Kyle and myself. Good. Fuck this place. If sealing the cemetery causes it to be swallowed by the earth, good riddance, Kyle spat, snubbing at his nose. As we drove towards the cemetery, we saw something that had Kyle gripping the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles had gone white. A ladder. One with property of Stonebrook Cemetery written on the side, was propped against a fence by the stump of the old white oak tree.
That fucker,
Eli said in disbelief.
He's trying to lure more kids into that damn cemetery.
Kyle stopped, and before any of us could get out, Jacob jumped from the bed of the truck and grabbed the ladder and threw it onto his shoulder. With a thumbs up, he ran back over and popped his head in the window. Hey, this we can get in without having to scale the fence. We might have to get out of there when shit starts to go down, so we might need someone to hang back and tip it over, Jacob said before he hopped back into the bed of the truck. Kyle drove down to bend in the road outside of the north gate, and we sat, waiting as the clock neared 9. We watched as Victor locked the gate and then stood for a moment staring out at the road. We all held our breath as we waited, willing him to turn and walk away. Another tremble shook the ground beneath us, our faces white with fear of the jostling of the truck making too much noise. As the trembling stopped, Victor turned and began walking into the cemetery, and we made our move, rolling the truck towards the gate. Jacob started the generator as I wrapped the chain around the bars of the gate. Eli positioned the ladder into place as Kyle grabbed the welding gear and rushed to the chain. Our window of opportunity would be small. Kyle and Eli would only have so long to get to the south gates as Jacob and I rushed to meet with Thomas and subdue Victor. I was certain that the spirits inside would already be rushing to Victor to inform him of the actions of his employees. The ground began to shake as I crested the gates with a sledgehammer. I jumped into hell. Sledgehammer gripped in my hands as I landed on the ground. The darkness greeted me with ravenous smiles. The shaking of the earth stopped as I stood up, but the monstrous forms of the spirits that greeted me did not ease me in the slightest. Things with twisted and too many faces, gnashing teeth of monsters with no eyes, the violent stares of spirits with facial features long since forgotten, all welcomed me with a collective shriek. Jacob landed hard, an unseen gun nearly bouncing from his shaking hand as he staggered to a standing position. We looked back at Kyle and Eli, still bracing themselves as the ground still revolted beneath their feet. Impressively, Kyle was still fast at work, welding the chain to a fixed position. With a word of luck from Eli, he threw the ladder onto the back of the truck and helped as best as he could as Kyle pushed the equipment onto the truck. The squeal of the truck as it peeled out could barely be heard from the choir of voices condemning our actions deafened the air around us. I stepped through the fog of maggots and crows, waving at the masses of decay and growth with a hammer, moving with determination towards the fountain to hopefully find a distracted and disoriented Victor at the mercy of Thomas. The sight of thousands of furious spirits shifting their forms to more and more horrific machinations did not unnerve me, but the sound of whistling coming from Victor was a sound that wakes me from slumber when it occurs. Standing between the fountain and us, Victor whistled, casually welding the crowbar that had been used against Isaac. By his side, Madame Dubois licked at the inky black vein running up Victor's neck to his cheek. Lips pursed to whistle, but the glee plastered over his face. Curled up in a ball behind him, Thomas held his leg, tears of pain streaming down his silently crying face. Jacob stepped in front of me, lifting the gun and peppering Victor's face with pellets. Despite the ravens of obsidian and shadows trying to block the shot with swiping razors, Victor's head jolted to one side and the whistling halted before turning back with a vile smile that stretched wider than his face. The blood oozing from the wounds and thick strands of mahogany strings turned into slugs and worms as it pulled onto the ground below. Did you really think that would work? His words were cut off by a slug slamming into his forehead, ripping a chunk of skull and brain from the top of his head and dropping his body into the water of the fountain. Jacob rushed to Thomas. As I stepped to the fountain, the sounds of footsteps barely audible over the howling of Mr. Weber, swiping at us with impact, but slicing through the fragile frames of starving hordes. I tightened my grip around the handle of the sledgehammer as Kyle approached us with Michael in tow, a smile beaming on both their faces until they saw the injured Thomas. With a nod from Kyle as he and Jacob picked up Thomas and began making their way to awaiting Eli, I leveraged the hammer for my first swing. With a solid crack, the hammer connected with the statue of Phantasos. I was standing, looking at my wife as she smiled up at me. We were in the maternity ward, and she held up our child for me to see. She cooed at the baby, who nuzzled up closer against her chest. "She looks just like her daddy," my wife said, sweat still on her forehead and bags under her eyes, but never before more beautiful. I placed a hand on her arm. As I looked between her and our child, my other hand held tight onto the sledgehammer. I recoiled from the shock of impact and lifted the hammer again for another swing, Victor, coughing up water and blood, slowly began to sit up. The spirits of the night screamed in terror as Mrs. McCarthy and Professor Joel began ripping chunks of flesh from one another and shoved the lumps into their mouths. Captain Iker and Madame Dubois grabbed at Victor to lift him up, fending off masses of sludge and feathers that bit off tiny pieces of their leathery skin. I swung the hammer at Victor just as he began to open his mouth, connecting on the side of his head, mashing his ear with an echoing crack. His body flung back into the water as Mr. Weber howled louder, grabbing the contractor and throwing his wrought iron speared body at me. Passing right through me, the contractor pummeled into the jerking body of the amber, ewe, opossum tails, fish gills, and the three-headed fox that was eating the slugs and maggots that clouded around it. I recovered from the swing and brought it down again on the statue of Phoebiter, breaking off a huge chunk from its side. I was sitting behind the desk of the mayor. The woman from the diner leaning over towards me. Her flowery perfume filled my nostrils as her pale cleavage was inches from my face, revealed from the neckline of her dress that pummeled down her front. Her face, unblemished and absent of the scar, whispered in my ear, "Sir, are you sure we should do this here? Someone could walk in on us at any moment." She threw a leg over my lap as one of my hands was running down her back. The other tightened around the wood of the sledgehammer's handle. A massive quake shook through the cemetery, dropping me to my knees in the water of the fountain. Pieces of marble fluttered to the ground as serpentine limestone and wood wrapped around the statues to shield it. Teddy yelled at me to stop what I was doing before swallowing the Gordy twins whole. The bark of the skin caught fire and began to leak inky tar as he howled in anger and pain. Madame Dubois looked around nervously as Captain Iker began breaking apart, his antlers hitting the ground as the bones began to gain more and more cracks. Victor was dragged from the fountain by tendrils and tentacles, thorny vines piercing his limbs and lifting his flaccid form to an upright position. With Victor's head still slumped down as the vines began to shake him violently, I took another swing at the fountain, knocking Victor's head off with a crunch of metal against stone. Standing before me, in a room filled with mirrors of different sizes and shapes, some cracked and some not, a man and a woman stood before a clock with many hands on the clock face. My vision doubled as the man and woman were actually a boy and a girl before it quadrupled to a combination of all four. I closed my eyes to avoid the overload of input my vision was trying to decipher. When I opened them again, two men, likely brothers, swung from an old train with a woman holding the arm of one of the two men. When I closed and opened my eyes again, I was back in the room with many mirrors. My vision assaulted by the conflicting images before the scene changed back to the train. The man without the woman on his arm reached towards something I couldn't make out, likely a lever, as the train began to increase in speed. Victor was rushing towards me, his arms outstretched, screaming in rage with pieces of flesh hanging from his head, the inky black veins bulging throughout his face, the thorny vines wrapped around his body. I fell back over the lip of the fountain, wildly swinging the hammer up at any attacker and connecting with an agape maw, tearing at the flesh and breaking the bone. His jaw, permanently disfigured and barely hanging together. Madame Dubois began tearing at her face as Mr. Weber was swarmed by the spirits I had grown so familiar with over the 15 years working here. Each one biting down with rabid fury. Teddy, aflame and falling apart in chunks of burnt limestone, attempted to swallow a disintegrating Iker before falling to his side as his mouth was forced closed by his impact to the ground. I pushed myself to my feet and swung the hammer again at the joining point of the two statues. The ground roared beneath me in a violent upheaval of protest. A man that looked like Victor stood next to someone similar to the statue of the town founder. They were sitting at a table with a long scroll that I was certain wasn't made of paper. The man took out a small knife and cut his hand, drawing out a steady stream of blood. He laid the knife down and picked up a quill. Dipping the quill in his blood, he signed the scroll as the Victor look-alike smiled with devilish intent. The man was on a ship sailing through a storm. The cries of people from below could barely be heard as thunder and rain deafened all, the clinking of chains barely audible beneath it all. I gasped for air as I steadied myself from the last scream from the earth. Victor pushed at the ground, barely able to get his body to cooperate, his horrid howling at the pain coursing through his body barely masked the anger on his destroyed face. With one final swing, the hammer smashed against the statues, bringing them down into the waters below. All the spirits stopped moving, frozen in their states of self-destruction. All except for Michael, who approached Victor with no joy on his face, only determination. He put a boot on Victor's head and forced it to the ground. Thank you for everything you've done. I think it is time that you get out of here. With a nod, I dropped the hammer and stepped towards Michael. I hope you can finally be free, I said before wrapping my arms around Michael with a hug. A stunned Michael placed an arm around me, returning the unfamiliar gesture. Hurry up. You don't want to be caught in what's next, Michael said, tears of joy trickling down his cheeks. I placed both hands on his shoulders and gave a quick squeeze before racing towards the south gate. The pulses of quakes and tremors shaking with each step. I pushed myself to run faster than I had done before in my life. With my friends in sight, I scaled the ladder and dropped out to join them in a tearful reunion. The violent shaking of the earth ceased after one final break, as a furious roar of death screamed from the cemetery, forcing our hands over our ears. As the adrenaline fled my body, I collapsed to the ground. Jacob and Kyle helped me to the bed of the truck with Thomas before they got in with Eli, and we drove away from the cemetery. I looked down at my watch. Cracked and broke, stuck at 1:37 permanently. I leaned over and asked Thomas for the time. He smiled and said that it had just turned to 6:01. That was the last day I lived in my hometown. I packed everything I could into my vehicle and drove out of town, a dark storm forming over the town as I drove away. Those first few weeks became a blur of highways, hotels, and hamburgers as I didn't stop until I was on the other side of the country. There I began the journey I am on now, constantly running from my past, always staying just ahead of the ghosts of guilt at the fate of the town. I had received calls from Eli, Jacob, Thomas, and Kyle during those first few days. All were planning to leave as well. The town had stormed non-stop since I left, and a permanent haze had settled over the cemetery. As the years passed, I slowly fell out of touch with those guys until the only one I was still in contact with was Thomas. Before I had decided to leave the States, I found myself on the highway that would lead the state routes that would take me back to my hometown. Nearing where the exit would be, I saw no note of the exit or even the road. I had doubled back when I was certain I would have passed the exit, still with no luck at finding the way back home. I was able to get in touch with Thomas, who was equally confused. Because of his injured leg, he was one of the last of my friends to leave the town. He said that people had slowly begun getting out of town, but the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer the quaint, little, small town it had been all our lives. The cemetery was gone. Nothing but a hazy fog left behind. Anyone who stepped in found themselves stepping out of the other side of the fog immediately, without any way of finding anything within the fog. Destroying the cemetery had erased the physical trace of my hometown. The good luck finally went away. I don't know if the rest of the town was able to get out, a guilt I have carried with me ever since. Now as my hair grows thin and white, I keep moving forward. The constant momentum trying to take me further and further away from that place. From Stonebrook Cemetery. The cemetery I worked in as a night guard. where the voices inside wanted out. Epilogue. I stumbled out of another bar and staggered down the cobblestone road towards my rental, above a clockmaker's shop. As I fumbled with my keys to unlock the door and climbed up the steps to my waiting bed, the shop owner stepped out from the shop, wiping his hands with a dirty cloth. "Drinking heavy already?" the man said with a thick German accent, a familiar face full of sadness at my destructive behavior. "So?" I asked, steadying myself with a hand against the door to maintain my balance. "I enjoy a good pilsner, but be drunk at noon is no good," he said, slowly closing the distance between us, a slight limp with every step. "Fuck off, Michel," I slobbered, wishing to lay down to a drunken oblivion. "No, friend. You need coffee. You need to sober up," Michel said, placing a hand on my shoulder and guiding me into the shop with little resistance. I sat in the chair as Michel went and grabbed a cup of hot coffee. He set it before me and pointed at it for me to drink. I complied and recoiled at the familiar taste of the hot bitterness. We sat wordlessly as Michel set the gears within the clock, glancing at me to verify I was remaining in place and drinking the coffee. As I sat down the empty cup, Michel stood up and left the room. When he returned, he brought the coffee pot and filled my cup back up and told me to drink before returning to his craft. As I finished the second cup, I felt the haze of drunkenness fade, and the jitteriness of caffeine rush through my veins. Michel wiped his hands again and turned to face me, the sadness gone and a cold look of disappointment on his face. The look made me ashamed. This man, who had been outlandishly kind to me since I had arrived in Germany, and in return, I had been nothing more than a drunken shade rambling to bars and shambling back. "Tell me the story," Michel said, his eyes unmoving, his voice not allowing for excuses to his demand. Between tears and agony and the torment of reliving it all, I told Michel about Stonebrook and my time working in the cemetery. As the sun lowered from its zenith to twilight, I finished my tale, a slight shake in my now hoarse voice. With many kind words, Michel confronted me before removing a letter addressed to me, sliding it across the workbench for me to open. After a minute of staring at the sealed envelope, my hand reached out and opened it, pulling the folded paper out to read the invitation. "You are hereby cordially invited to the grand reopening of the Stonebrook Cemetery. After decades of renovations, we are thrilled to announce that our once grand facility is now open for the community to come back and see all of the marvelous changes we have made. Act fast and see our newly designed layout and luxurious plots to spend your hereafter. We look forward to seeing you soon." Signed, Director of Cemetery Coordinations, Vincent Victor, Regent. I dropped the letter, fear racing throughout my body. Michel placed a hand on my shoulder as he read the letter himself. It was time to go home, but I wasn't sure if I was ready.